Well, thank you, Lou. I don't know how many people in the audience will remember this, but Lou invited me to speak to this group 10 years ago. Oh, I see some heads. That's terrific. Well, I've changed up the talk a little bit since then. 10 years ago, Lou asked me to cover a variety of topics, and one of them was the decline of newspapers. So this is a story that's been going on for a while. So I'm back today, and I got to correct Lou on one thing. Lou, I'm the retired senior managing editor. I retired about a year ago, but I still write the column that I hope all of you read every single Sunday in the paper or online. Every Tuesday, a new one is posted today. So I'm going to speak for about 12 minutes or so, maybe a little longer, and then Roy is going to wake you up and show you a video after I'm done speaking, and then we'll take all of your questions, and I hope you have a lot of them. You know, the newspaper business was a lucrative business for many, many decades. If you go back, really the last decades of the 1800s and for most of the 20th century, owning a newspaper was very lucrative. Now, not as lucrative as owning Google or Facebook or Amazon, those other big media companies, but newspapering was a prosperous industry. And it didn't mean that every newspaper that came along survived, right? I mean, Syracuse has had more than a dozen newspapers, closer to 24 newspapers in its history. And you know which one survives. In fact, the Post-Standard, in 10 years, one more decade, will celebrate its 200th birthday. So 200 years in just another 10 years. Now, it's not going to be an easy 10 years for the Post-Standard to continue, or for any newspaper to continue. On March 26th, the Pew Research Center, which does a lot of journalism research, reported that Americans thought their local news media were doing well financially. In fact, 70% of Americans thought their local news outlets were doing very well financially, not a problem. It was also interesting that Pew found only 14% of Americans paid anything at all for their local news, like a subscription. Despite what many people think, local news organizations are not financially healthy. The audience is bigger than ever because it's online, but they're not financially healthy. In fact, the week after Pew reported its findings about the health of the newspaper industry, the Watertown Times, a grand, wonderful newspaper just up I-81 from all of us, the Watertown Times couldn't make its payroll. You need to know what that means. Now, I don't subscribe to the Watertown Times, but I did read the story that they posted about that problem online. And I sent a link to my former colleagues at the Post-Standard and Syracuse.com with a little note saying, hey, I hope you're all doing well. And I heard back, nothing like that here. Phew, thank goodness. In fact, these executives I sent that to told me that they had a good surge recently of ad sales, so they had something to be thankful for. So, what that means is whatever problems you perceive here in Syracuse are not unique to Syracuse. They're everywhere. And in fact, in Syracuse, we're probably doing a little bit better than most other places. For instance, the Denver Post. You know Denver, it's a big city. The Denver Post and the denverpost.com online has a news staff now that it's about the size of the Post-Standard and Syracuse.com news staff. In Denver, they have almost 75 journalists in their newsroom, where at Syracuse.com and the Post-Standard, we have about 63. So very similar in size. Yet Denver has 2.9 million people, and contrast that to the Syracuse metro area of about 660,000, and you can see the difference in the scale there. Part of this is because a hedge fund bought the Denver Post. So many newspapers are struggling. They're easy pickings for anybody now. This hedge fund bought the Denver operation and is squeezing out every single penny it can before it finishes dismantling the newspaper and shutting it down. That's what's going to happen in one of America's largest cities, a growing city, because it's just not as profitable as it used to be. In fact, my previous newspaper, the Union Tribune, I worked in San Diego at the Union Tribune before we moved to Syracuse. Since 2009, it has had 5 different owners. 5 owners in 10 years' time. One of them was a real estate developer who bought the paper on the cheap for its prime location. Then you know what the developer did? He evicted his own newspaper staff so he could redevelop the site. They scrapped the presses, dismantled them, hauled them away, and the paper is now printed in Los Angeles. Speaking of Los Angeles, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Los Angeles Times, but it's a respectful, grand, big newspaper that we can be very proud of in journalism. It was teetering, but a billionaire bought it, and it's on a little bit better ground right now. But like so many newspapers, its grand old downtown location was sold, and now the Los Angeles Times, the skeleton staff it still has, is in a warehouse out by the airport. It's similar to Chicago Tribune, the Miami Herald. They've sold their places, so many others. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, not far from here, is now America's largest city without a daily newspaper printed daily. Warren Buffett owns the Buffalo News. Now, you all know who Warren Buffett is. He had his big annual meeting over the weekend in Omaha. He's one of America's richest people, a grand investor. And he loves newspapers. He always has. At his big meeting, he still has a newspaper tossing contest, recalling his days as a newspaper delivery boy. Even so, he says the newspaper business is toast. He said, they're going to disappear. By the way, he didn't say that in an interview with a newspaper reporter. He said that to the managing editor of Yahoo Finance. At the same time, this is all going on, we have a president who declares honest journalism to be fake news and the enemy of the people. In fact, an Ipsos poll last fall reported that 43% of the people in his party say he should be granted the power to shut down any news outlet he doesn't like. Now, how did all this come about? How are we from being a prosperous, strong business that could report to all of you what was going on in our community, our nation, and the world? Well, I'm going to take just a very brief tour of recent history and see what has weakened the newspapers. And I'm going to start in the 1980s, so not too long ago. There's a lot of reasons, and I'm going to oversimplify it, I know. And if you want more, you can ask questions or see me afterwards. But at that time in the 1980s, Walmart began to dominate retail. Walmart does not and never has advertised in newspapers. It began to undercut the position of local retailers that had been a mainstay of newspaper advertising. To survive, many of these local stores began consolidating or selling themselves to larger chains. That further weakened their ties, these stores' ties to the local community, including newspaper advertising. And despite what you might think, advertising is what really supports a newspaper. Subscriptions have always been a smaller part of the revenue. So while retail was changing dramatically, another thing happened, seemingly unrelated. The Reagan administration ended the fairness doctrine for broadcasters. This is back still in the 1980s. Now, that didn't affect newspapers directly, but it opened a window for a new kind of media commentary. That's because the AM radio band was dying back then in the 1980s. FM had eclipsed it for music and so many other things. And the effect of this change, ending the fairness doctrine, was to save and rescue AM radio. Why? No longer did broadcasters need balanced reports on public affairs to renew their licenses. It opened the door to talk radio shows like those pioneered by Rush Limbaugh. Stations could go for hours and hours without any regard to fairness, and certainly not any real reporting. No actual reporting took place. Many listeners began to shift their idea of what media should be like. They began to shift their idea. They began applying that thinking to newspaper journalism too. So instead of expecting news media to report fairly and accurately, people learned that they should select media that matched their own viewpoints. And it's a natural human thing. You surround yourself with people who think like you, act like you, and everything. Newspapers always challenge people to think differently, to understand deeper into something. But that wasn't the case anymore if people could now begin to self-select what they were hearing and what they were learning and how they were learning it. And if that news outlet didn't match their own viewpoint, well, it must be biased and it must be wrong. That became a much more common belief. About that time, CNN began, actually in 1980. But it was really the first Gulf War in 1991 that showed the power of a 24-hour news operation on cable. I remember watching the war live on my TV at home at night. Probably many of you did too. Even so, the photographs from those same events didn't arrive in our newsroom until a day or perhaps 2 days later. A photographer with the troops, remember this was still in the film days. CNN had satellite uplink, but film was what news photographers had. A photographer with the troops had to get that film back somehow, so that probably took more than a day, to someone who could then process the film and transmit it back to New York or wherever and have it distributed to newspapers. So those papers wouldn't come to a newsroom for a day or maybe two, and then, probably not in time, until the newspaper would be printed the next day. So technology was shifting people's expectations and ideas of immediacy. The immediacy was changing. News has always been a perishable product, if you will, but now it was becoming perishable even faster. By the 1990s, the internet was becoming known. What really established the internet for most people was the World Wide Web, especially the invention of the first web browser, Mosaic. Companies like Craigslist, Google, and Facebook took away newspaper advertisers. Around the nation, newspaper classified sections completely disappeared. And then Amazon changed the way people shop. You don't look for ads in your paper anymore, you go online. And when you go online, chances are you're going to someplace like Amazon. And all that further hurt the many retailers that used to be mainstays of newspaper advertising. Now, these new media companies took away enormous amounts of advertising money. They became big media companies without having to support newsrooms, however. For instance, Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, about 1995, single-handedly destroyed classifieds in most American newspapers. When he came into the market, the classifieds in the newspaper dried up and mostly went away. It put tens of thousands of people at newspapers all across the country out of work. And how many did he employ? Well, Craigslist now has 40 people working in its San Francisco office. 40 people. Once upon a time, the classified department here at the Post-Standard and the Herald-Journal days employed probably about 40 people itself. So these companies became big media without any of the traditional news media responsibilities or their integrity. For instance, when companies like Google are challenged by the government in China, and the government says we're going to censor you unless you change, what does Google do? It immediately caves in. Sure, whatever you want, censor away. We will play by your rules. It's your country after all. And that further diminishes how news and information, honest news and information, can spread. Contrast that to the New York Times, when it was also faced with Chinese censorship. The New York Times, unlike Google, did not cave in and said, no, we are going to report honestly, and we're going to deliver our product the way we want it to be delivered, not the way the dictator and his minions want it to be delivered. And what happened? Their reporters were banished from the country for years. This was all it started in the 1980s, but it's been growing. Well into the 2000s, most people still relied on computers for getting access to the internet. That's what they relied on. They'd go home or they'd have a computer at work. People joked at the time about how it was a big time waster. Remember all of that? But then in 2007, Steve Jobs announced the creation of the iPhone. Now, fast forward just 12 years, mobile devices are a huge success. We probably all have one. But more importantly, nobody Nobody had to wait for a newspaper to be delivered to find out what was going on. You no longer even had to get back to your computer to find out what was going on, right? Anyone could read news whenever and wherever they wanted. And they can read news from around the world, not just what their local newspaper or local website chose to print. They can buy, sell, learn, and watch video anywhere at any time. It's really a remarkable device, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't want to live without it. How many of you know anyone under 40 who subscribes to a local newspaper? There might be some. All right, Claire. Yes, all right. That's great. But instead, whether they subscribe or not, they have the immediacy of this, that iPhone I was just talking about. They don't have to wonder about anything again. They don't have to wait for news of any kind. The answer is always right here. And that has changed the business dramatically as well. So advertising changed. People's expectation of immediacy and convenience changed. And on the radio, on cable, and especially online, people gravitated to one-sided views that matched their own opinions. People were no longer exposed to reporting, the kind of reporting that perhaps we all grew up with. And it made it ever easier to spew out propaganda masquerading as news. So you don't really always know what you're reading when you go online, do you? Does it come from a reputable source or not? And authoritarian governments around the world have noticed this, and Roy's going to talk about that, I'm sure. They stepped up efforts to undermine a free press. Now, would-be dictators have always existed, but a free press was one of the guards against them. Now, authoritarian governments could attack a free press, a weakened press, with impunity. They knew the press didn't really have the strength to fight back. It costs money to go to court or to stand up to governments and get the information you want. And on the internet, these same dictators, or would-be dictators, could control information in a way never before possible. As I mentioned, online, you don't necessarily know, am I reading propaganda or is this authentic? And many of those same citizens, as we saw in that poll I mentioned earlier, no longer consider freedom of the press as a liberty worth defending. It's no longer a defense against tyranny. In fact, silencing journalists, sometimes with murder, is now a common tactic among the strongmen around the world. Roy, who oversees the Tully Center's Free Speech Awards, will tell you more about that growing danger. Now you should remember, dictators have always wanted to control information and flood their people with propaganda. Back in the 1980s, my wife and I visited Germany, and while we were there on that trip, we went to Dachau, the concentration camp. It was Germany's first concentration camp, and it's now a museum about the rise of Adolf Hitler. And inside, we saw a documentary about his rise. Now, you all know what Hitler did. He rounded up millions of people, and he murdered millions of people. But do you know who Hitler rounded up first? I learned on that trip. First, he went after professors, he went after clergy, and he went after journalists. He rounded them up, and he stuck them in Dachau. And after that, there wasn't any real news in the Third Reich. The German people were left without any moral leadership, any intellectual leadership, no way on which to really judge their government. And their worst fears and hatreds were being encouraged at the same time. That's what the government was doing. Now this is why dictators always tried to shut down independent newspapers and turn pliable news outlets into propaganda arms. Our founding fathers knew that, right? King George did not want a free, open, and independent press. In fact, what did he do? He said, "Get those guys! Kill them!" He didn't want anything to do with someone who would criticize him. You didn't find a free and open press in China. You don't. You don't find a free and open press in North Korea. Saddam Hussein didn't allow it. Neither did the Taliban. Dictators can't stand criticism or disagreement. They can't stand the facts. So whenever someone in power wants to muzzle a free and open press, you should be asking, Why is that? Whenever political leaders and media outlets become cheerleaders for each other and vilify independent, honest reporting as the enemy of the people, you should be asking, now why is that? What do they really want? Here in Syracuse, we're not immune to all of these pressures. It's obvious to you. I started Syracuse.com in 1994, as Lou said. At that time, you could count on one hand the number of newspapers delivering news on the web. Like everything on the internet then, it was free. We didn't charge for it. Our thinking, my thinking, was that, oh, advertising would make it a sustainable and viable business, just like, you know, had been done by broadcast media, radio and television for generations. Looking back, I was wrong. We should have had the same kind of subscription charge from the beginning that we did for the newspaper. Now more and more newspaper websites, including Syracuse.com, are beginning to have the subscription model and you pay for it. But readers now have so many free choices they don't have to pay for. Few of them are paying to subscribe to any sort of news. So the advertising money went away, and the tiny bit of subscription revenue that's left can't support the newsroom. So we're at a point where many good news organizations are going to fail. They're living on borrowed time. Will they survive? No, a lot of them won't. Those that do survive, they are going to have to change in ways that we may not like at times. For one thing, they might charge more. Or they may have fewer resources to cover the news we wish they'd cover. They'll have fewer reporters because they can't afford to pay as many as they used to a decade or 20 years ago. So we're at a point where you can get news from around the world right now, anywhere, anytime. News from anywhere, any outlet. The irony in that is there's less and less local reporting to get. On Saturday, the Wall Street Journal reported, the shrinking of the local news landscape is leaving Americans with less information about what's happening close to them. And if you want, that story is in Saturday's paper. You can look at it here, or it's out. I checked, it's out there in the reading area as well. So the Wall Street Journal reported that local newspapers are vanishing, and it quoted a Harvard expert who predicts half of America's surviving newspapers will be gone by 2021. I hope that Harvard expert's wrong, but it's a pretty glum thing to consider. Warren Buffett, that billionaire, newspaper-loving guy, he doesn't think newspapers will survive either, and he's usually pretty smart on where he places his bets. In the Syracuse area, you can still read a daily newspaper, whether it's online, on your computer, on a mobile device, or in print. You can go to Syracuse.com. On the web, you can listen to Syracuse.com's podcasts. You can watch Syracuse.com's video reports and their channels. You can see the Syracuse.com app on your phone. So we have good ways to get the news out to you still. In that way, we are very, very lucky. And I'm very proud of all of those journalists, my former colleagues, who have changed, who have survived and thrived in this new world we're in. So finally, I hope we're all around in 2029, because then we'll all be able to raise a toast to the Post Standard for surviving 200 years. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to
Thank you.
Oh, I thought I was going to be depressing today. Thanks, Dan.
you can uplift this now.
Well, just to dovetail before I get into my focus today, Stan pointed out some real interesting points about ownership, and I'd just like to play off that it might not all be grim news, depending on who some of these owners are. I think we can. I never thought of the fairness doctrine demise as really leading the domino effect, but that's an interesting point. But I'd actually point to financing of media nowadays with publicly traded companies that have major media enterprises, as well as the rise of the hedge fund investment groups. The hedge fund guys are looking for quick hits. They're doing a backdoor to get real estate in prime locations. But the real estate run, that's been around for a while. That was going on in the 60s and the 70s too, where real estate companies were buying up newspapers just because they happened to be in great parts of the town. Right? Just here in Syracuse, Herald Square we have, and the former Post Standard's prime real estate. So that happened in cities all over the country. But the fact that many companies have gone public and they're less interested in the product and more beholden to the bottom line and shareholders, and even you brought up Facebook and Craigslist and these entities. The reason why Mark Zuckerberg has $71 billion in his bank account is because Facebook is publicly traded. The day that IPO went forward, some of you might actually have Facebook stock, he made $8 billion. So that's why he's caving to dictators and less interested in supporting dissemination of information as much as he's interested in keeping his stock afloat. On the other hand, we do have a silver lining, maybe a golden lining, when we look at billionaires like Jeff Bezos, the Amazon founder, who was worth $160 billion before his divorce a couple of weeks ago. But he owns the Washington Post. So a billionaire who probably makes more an interest in a given day than the Washington Post makes in a long time, he can afford to take some losses. He can afford to keep that operation afloat. Stan mentioned the LA Times, bought by a billionaire who seems intent. Everything I've read about Mr. Sun Xiang indicates that he wants to keep the LA Times a respectable, honest, worthy newspaper. So, I think the vanity of owning a major media operation is still there for some of our billionaires. Just hope we get the right billionaires owning our newspapers. The right Charles Foster Kanes of the world who still want to have a newspaper with principles, and I think they're out there. And in many ways, you just look at what Jeff Bezos has done. I mean, he's turned the Washington Post back into an opposition newspaper. So, they're out there. We just need to find the right guys and appeal to their civic engagement models. But I'm primarily going to talk a little about, the threats to the press. And, I did want to say that, I do actually have a point of good news this morning. The two journalists in Myanmar who have been Reuters journalists who have been in prison for almost 500 days were released this morning. Walon and Kia who spent probably some really bad days in prison in Myanmar, and they were set up on phony charges. They were given leaked documents that they didn't even ask for, and arrested the minute those documents entered their hands. So these two reporters were actually nominated for the Tully Free Speech Award this year, and we couldn't give it to them because they probably wouldn't have been able to come to Syracuse given their predicament, but maybe we'll be able to get them here next year. But I would like to show you a short video, then I'll talk a little more about this year's Free Speech Award and how it relates to a lot of what we're talking about today. So this is short, it's only about 2 minutes. Hopefully we can play this nicely.
We're facing a crisis. There's a lack of faith, if you will, in the power of journalism. And that's very alarming, and that's a global phenomenon. Well, one thing we can talk about is the anti-terror framework. Well, and that framing of, you're with us or against us, that's for people in the United States, that maybe doesn't affect their daily lives. But in many parts of the world, that was the most convenient pretext that the government could find to basically equate critical journalism with support for terrorism. That's the framework we're seeing in countries like Turkey, where 81 journalists are in jail. The U.S. has been a leader. It's been an example in terms of advocating for the rights of journalists around the world.
Aren't you concerned, sir, that you are undermining the people's faith in the First Amendment, freedom of the press in this country, when you call stories you don't like fake news? Why not just say it's a story I don't like?
I do that.
Call it fake news,
No, I do
you're
that.
undermining
No,
confidence in our news media.
Here's the thing,
Isn't that
okay.
important?
This new president, based on his campaign rhetoric and some of the statements he's made, suggests that he's not going to be a friend of the critical media. He's not demonstrated deep tolerance or a commitment to First Amendment values. That creates a new global environment, and that's something that's very troubling.
So again, the video is available. It's a little dated. I mean, it's only a year old, but it's already dated, right? That's how fast things go. But the centerpiece was the Committee to Protect Journalists. That's an international organization based in New York City that does global advocacy for journalists. They track arrests and harassments and murders. And according to CPJ, 2018, 5 journalists were killed around the world, 250 were imprisoned, and 61 were missing. So, again, stark figures, and for a while, we in the U.S. were still, on the high ground on this issue, and in some ways we still are. We'll talk a little more about that, but it's very difficult for us to wag our judgmental American finger at the rest of the world and say, well, you can't imprison your journalists, you can't harass your journalists, because we're harassing our journalists now, or at least our leadership is. And that's troubling. Whenever we talk about President Trump's animosity with the press, we always think about President Obama going to the United Nations and declaring that he has to accept a lot of criticism as a leader, and that's part of our democratic tradition. So he was a good spokesman for First Amendment values, but the Obama administration was also one of the leading investigators of the press as well. Conventionalism was there were about 7 leak investigations that involved the press, more than any other administration combined. So even though the administration had a very public stance on criticism and upholding at least the appearance of First Amendment values around the world, there was this back door where it wasn't quite so nice. But still, he wasn't as hostile to the press as our current administration. And there should be hostility. I'm not a pie in the sky kind of guy that says, we all have to get along. But, where do we take it? And how does it go forward? And again, it's a global issue now. Again, the 2 journalists who just got out of jail were, as I said, were nominees for the Tully Free Speech Award. This year we honored a reporter from the Philippines. Actually, she's a publisher and editor of a news site called The Rappler, which is one of my favorite names for a news outlet. She came to Syracuse for a day, and I got the origins. Apparently she combined rap, talking, with ripples to make waves, and hence the Rappler. And the Rappler is making waves in the Philippines. It is critical of President Rodrigo Duterte, who has been described by many in the Filipino media as the Filipino Trump. Although we can laugh, I mean, it's a nice little nickname, but the Filipino Trump is committing mass murder. He's stacking the deck in government. He's openly corrupt, and again, he's killing people. He's killed thousands of people. He had a big campaign to round up drug dealers and drug users and just have summary executions. I mean, in an interview, he's actually bragged about killing people when he was in lower office. So Maria Ressa is publishing critical stories, and is facing a tremendous amount of blowback. She and the Rappler have faced up to 11 legal challenges. Some as frivolous as tax evasion, accusations of tax evasion, and some others as serious as cyber libel, which is a criminal issue in the Philippines. So she could technically go to jail for defaming even a public official, which you can't, it doesn't happen in the United States. She was arrested at the airport in Manila after coming back from an international trip a while ago. So she's facing significant difficulties, significant turmoil, and perhaps one of the things that's keeping her safe is the publicity and the accolades that she receives from organizations like mine, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and others. So one of the more poignant points that she made when she was up here a couple of weeks ago was her lamentations that she might go to jail because the institutions in the Philippines are corrupt. That the legal institutions, the judicial institutions, are all in cahoots with a corrupt dictator. There's no faith, she has no faith in the system. Juxtapose that to what we have here. Now we lamented that the Supreme Court is being somewhat stacked more to the right. And that's just political, that's politics, that's history, that's timing. And in some ways there's not, it's inevitable. But as far as the political and judicial infrastructure goes in the United States, we still have courts. We still have at least one part of the Congress that's an opposition, basically an arm of opposition, but our legal structure is still secure. And I think there's one stellar example of how that's played out, and that goes back to Jim Acosta. That was the reporter who was challenging Trump. He's a reporter at CNN, and he had his credentials at the White House revoked. They call it the hard pass. I mean, it's a special press pass that gave him special access. He had it revoked because the president didn't like him. Now, again, Acosta is a little theatrics with what he does, but that's TV. We're a couple of old print guys. We can poke fun at the TV folks for going for the camera. But there was an important message in that when his credentials were revoked. And what did CNN do? CNN litigated it. CNN challenged that revocation in court based on the First Amendment. Okay? And it was in federal court, and we probably have a few retired lawyers here. It was a federal issue challenging this federal government action based on the First Amendment. And it came up before a judge that was appointed by President Trump. So, again, we know federal judges get a lifetime appointment. They can do pretty much anything, except steal. But every now and then something like that happens. But the beauty of a lifetime appointment in the federal judiciary is a judge can rule the way the judge feels the law should play out. And we've seen some examples at the Supreme Court level on that over the years. Several of President Nixon's appointees ended up moving to the left and changing the balance on the court, which really irked President Nixon back in the day. But I think those days of Supreme Court justices softening up and moving to the other side are probably long since gone. But this judge, Judge Tim Kelly out of the federal court in Virginia, had the opportunity here. Right? He could have buckled. He could have said, well, you know, this is the guy that appointed me. I'll support him through my decisions. But that's not what he did. And I don't know much about this guy. Maybe I'm playing him up a little too much. Maybe he actually just didn't read the law and realize this was an outrageous act, regardless of politics. But he ruled that Acosta and CNN should have access to the White House based on, not based on the First Amendment, but based on the Fifth Amendment. It was a due process violation that the credentials were yanked, were taken away without fair notice, without a fair explanation, without due process. So even though he didn't rule on First Amendment grounds, he ruled on fairness grounds, which I think in some ways is just as valuable, if not more valuable, to our democracy than ruling on First Amendment grounds on that one, because it still adheres to process. It still adheres to a fair hearing and notice and discussion and at least some degree of reason and rational decision making. So, you know, when I had the opportunity to spend some time with Maria Ressa and talk about her travails and to compare them to what we have here, you know, as bad as we have it here and as bad as it looks and as grim as it looks and as much hand-wringing as many of us have been engaging in the last couple of years, we still have the institutions to support the law. How long that'll last, I don't know. Hopefully a little longer. But when we have our free press, our independent press, keeping track of this, keeping tabs on those in power, and keeping tabs on the institutions, that's, you know, those are good democratic principles and exercises. You know, just hope that, you know, our modern media landscape will fill in the void and keep the sunlight open for us. So I think with that, I guess the Stan and Roy show will entertain questions.
Before we do the questions, and don't be afraid to ask them, I must give total regard and affection to Anita Kupperman, who bakes for us every Thursday. And remember, I've been married to her for 62 years, but putting up with her for 65.
She deserves a medal.
2 medals. Secondly is, I can't share with you my gratitude to these 2 guys for coming here on a very important matter and for your interest in this matter. This matter of free press and being able to get your news at will is so important to all of us. And how grateful we are to live in this country, to live in the state, and for sure to live in this community. And to have the Newhouse people banging away, sending out journalists that I haven't figured out where they're going to work tomorrow. Which is a subject or a question you might be able to answer, because the Newhouse School is turning out journalists every day, or every week, or every year. And there's no newspapers for them to go work, and very few. So now we'll start with your questions, and who's got the first question?
Please tell me how all of you would answer someone who doesn't have a computer. It's almost as if the whole world is expected to turn it on instead of picking up a newspaper.
Yeah, everybody should have a computer.
I don't think anybody should have to have a computer. I think it's a very convenient, helpful device. I'm glad I've had one for a long time, but you don't have to have one. There are other ways to stay informed or connect with people. You know, there is a printed newspaper, there are television shows, there's, you know.
And then you said what, Watertown no longer had the paper.
No, the Watertown Times couldn't make its payroll that week. It's still publishing, I'm sorry if I missed that.
Okay.
But they couldn't make their payroll
People
that
need a
week.
paper.
Yeah, so the paper was still coming out, but the reporters, clearly, you know, they have expenses and mortgages and doctor bills to pay as well, so.
They could walk dogs.
So there's wonderful guys like Bezos and the guy at the Los Angeles Times that have rescued these wonderful papers. But where are the billionaires and millionaires that are going to rescue the little local papers?
I don't think they've realized how lucrative local publishing could be. Although I don't, it's not the grand scale of, you know, a marquee paper like the Post or the LA Times. And I guess we need to have local millionaires and billionaires realizing the potential.
Call up Donnie Newhouse.
How about Mr. Weitzman?
Well, the thing is, the newspaper is shouldn't be considered a charity. It is indeed a business, and it ought to be run as a business. And over the decades, you know, with a couple dozen newspapers in the Syracuse area, the ones that survived were the ones that were managed well and did a good job. And that's how they could survive in a very, very competitive environment over all those decades, right? So, you know, it's not a charity. It needs to figure out a way to remain profitable. You know, it's not a core value. Somebody told me this years ago. Profit is not a core value, but it is a core need. So you need to make a profit in any business, including a newspaper business. And there are smart people trying to figure this out. It may not always be printing it, though. It might be, over time, if these predictions I told you about come true, only online or in other ways still to be invented. But the owners of newspapers can still have a business that thrives if they're smart about it, if they're willing to adapt, if they're willing to serve their audience and do all the things that are necessary. But it's going to be a lot harder than it ever was. And the Newhouse family, which was named, you know, supported the Newhouse School and owns the Post-Standard and all of this, did very well for decades with its publishing operations. But they've also been covering their bets in many, many ways over the years. For instance, they're the primary owner of Reddit, the online site. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Reddit, but you know, they invest in that. And they've invested in other things from time to time to try and figure out how do we bet on the next big thing. And by the way, maybe that can help us support the newspapers that we love and want our communities to depend upon. I'm sorry, you should.
It's okay.
You're the professor, you should be calling them.
The way I call people is a little different.
I was wondering if you have an opinion about the roles and the survival strategies of other local print media, such as the Syracuse New Times, which just changed their strategy, free distribution, and have gone to a subscription model. The Eagle newspapers media group, which has its strategies, or even the table hopping. You know, one of the ironies of Central New York media is there's a guy that writes a column in the table hopping newspaper, which is one of the most interesting, almost investigative journalistic column. Guy named Bill McClellan or something. Do you have any opinion about any of it? Because they're confronted with the same challenges, business model challenges that the Post and others have.
Yeah, I think it's hard for the New Times or the Eagle Bulletin or any print operation to continue. So a little story about that might be somewhat enlightening, the Post Standard, we have this wonderful new press that's now about 20 years old, so we print a lot of papers, including the New Times, or at least we did when I left. I presume they still do. So we print the New Times, we print the Utica paper, we print the Oneida paper, we print lots of other weeklies and circulars and so forth. So that's one way we can figure out, how do we keep our presses and our press room busy and bring in some new kinds of revenue, and at the same time, it decreases the costs of like the Utica Observer Dispatch. They no longer have to support a press. Well, they were at the point they're gonna have to buy a new press, which is 20 million or more for a paper their size. So they no longer had that expense where we got a little more revenue. So there are ways to do it. And it's a business arrangement. It's not like we bought them or anybody did any favors. It's a business. So that's one way companies like, say, the New Times look for ways to, and it'll be interesting to see if the New Times survives with a subscription model instead of free. It'll also be interesting to see how the Eagle Bulletin, also on a subscription model, but it's a free subscription. All you have to do is say, yeah, I want it, and it comes. For the New Times, you have to say, I'll pay you for it, now send it. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean,
I guess there's no
everybody
answer.
There's no answer.
Yeah, the real answer is, Lou, you okay.
Mike,
No,
I thought you had a
that
question.
was part of the answer, by what you just said. I was wondering if continuing to print the Post Standard on paper is a burden, financial burden. And if the company, if the business would be better off if it was entirely online and didn't have the expenses involved in printing paper.
The real answer is no. It would not be better to go completely online, not at this point. Now, maybe someday in the future. That's because there is still, it's not great, but there's still good advertising revenue to be received by distributing a newspaper. And you see that, for instance, in Sunday's paper. If you see the A section, all of those ads, it's pretty healthy most Sundays. Now, it isn't through the week, but on Sunday it is. Also on Sundays, you see all of those inserts, those circulars that are in there, with the coupons and everything else. Those companies have paid to, have that distributed as well. So you wouldn't get any of that revenue if you were just online. And online, you can't charge as much either because, anybody can distribute something online. So for instance, a lot of the ads you see on Syracuse.com are not necessarily sold here in Syracuse. They're sold by Google. And Syracuse.com is a Google affiliate so that their ads, when the nanoseconds that somebody comes to a site, Google knows a lot about them and can transmit that and decide which ad to serve up on which website. It's all based in just less than a blink of an eye. And in the same way, Syracuse ad salespeople working, employed by the Post Standard and Syracuse.com sell ads that you will never see here because they go into the Google network or other kinds of networks and are displayed elsewhere. And they serve businesses and advertisers. I don't remember the name of it, but there's a little chain of airports. I know one is in Alaska and I forget where else, that the folks at my company, or my own company, Advanced Media New York, Post Standard and Syracuse.com, they do the ad work for those airports. Now, who would think that an airport in Alaska would have a Syracuse news staff, or not news, advertising staff do its work? It just shows how different it is and how you gotta look for opportunities literally around the nation to be able to support your operation now.
So could you assess the quality of journalism in some of the online publications like Axios, Politico, and BuzzFeed, which got sort of bumped by the Mueller group? How does one find out where quality journalism exists online?
I mean, some of it is just trial and error, finding out what, just doing a lot of reading and seeing what you trust and what looks good. I mean, this gets into a news literacy discussion, and it's like, what looks good.
Does the new Apple plan sort that out for us a bit?
You can find charts on the internet that will look at balance and fairness and accuracy and plot them, so you could find something that meets your needs. Some people's needs tend far to the left or the right, but I look for something in the middle, so I know I'm getting arguably a better quality product.
One way to judge the quality, it's what editors do to reporters' stories. Look at this website and say, how do they know that? How do they know that? In other words, does it appear to be fully sourced and reported? Is the information attributed? Is it not just opinion, but is it based on facts? That's what reporters and editors do. And Roy was talking about news literacy. The audience has to do a lot more of that on their own now. How do they know that? Is this just a bunch of opinion they're spouting out? And if you read enough of it, you can usually tell if it's just opinion, or if, there's an attempt at some honest, serious, attributed reporting here, and they make it clear how they know that, and there are facts involved in it as well. So that's one way to begin to judge.
But not only that, there's some great stuff going on online. I mean, I'm still a print guy, I still get the Post Standard delivered at home. But, there is a lot of good journalism. I might be one of the last people I know. There's a lot of great journalism online. And part of the beauty of this is the immediacy, the global reach, but also the reader's connection to the people producing this information, producing this news. There are millions of potential editors and fact checkers out there. Right? If you read something and it doesn't look right, or a typo or a fact error, you have access to get that fixed. Comments or direct connection or direct communication with editors and writers to make a better product. And to a certain extent, that's crowdsourcing, but I think there are connections that can be made that can help people realize and find the good stuff out there. And there's some good stuff. There's some garbage too, obviously, but there's some stuff out
This
there.
Google News Source bias chart, and it shows you facts versus bias. Look for something in the top middle.
Yeah. Heavy on the facts, low on the bias.
AP, Reuters.
In today's shift from paper news to TV news, I always worry about fake news. In the old days, we could count on retractions from the newspapers, and we would count on the newspapers being more honest in their publications. However, when somebody from the Adirondacks, just point to a point, looks at CNN and then Fox, and there's two different fake news, one is fake and one may be fake, and one is, how does one tell that one is not correct or incorrect or partially fake?
Well, I think if you see, first of all, as Roy said, we're a couple print guys. So I got to tell you my bias there. TV news has always been shallow, insulting. It's just awful. But and they've got a hard job to do. I'm not saying it's an easy thing and that they're lazy or anything. It's a hard job, but it's just they've never. It's shallow, insulting, and anyway. So, but when you watch television news, knowing that it's going to be shallow, all right? Have real reporting? In other words, are they reporting some facts, or is this all opinion? And it may vary by the time of day or which channel you're watching. And I would never, ever rely strictly on television news to find out what's going on. I just wouldn't, because they just never have had the resources. So judge, but they've got moving pictures, and that's pretty cool. So you watch TV and then you judge that by what else you read, what reputable organizations.
So the problem with that is the population, the reading people are dying out. My children don't read anymore. They're intelligent, they're educated, graduates of universities, they still don't read. And they watch the news or the tube in order to get their information. And sometimes they come back with the wrong information. They never double check it, or never.
You put your finger on it,
Yeah.
you don't double check it. We all need to double check it. We should always double check things. It's what an editor does, and it's what a reader should have always been doing. And I think it's harder in some ways to do now. Even as it seems, it's easier because you have the whole world at your fingertips. But it's harder maybe to judge the authenticity and the accuracy than it used to be, because it can be disguised a lot more easily. I don't know if we're getting at your point there. No.
You mentioned be careful when you're watching the TV news, but in many times when I'm watching MSNBC or CNN, they're quoting Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA. So I think the media and the press feed off each other in many ways.
You mean the television and newspaper style? Yeah.
One's quoting, the MSNBC is quoting the Times, which is good. They're feeding off each other.
Throughout my entire career, Mel, you can talk. The newspapers set the editors of the television had to read a newspaper to know what was going on.
Exactly.
Unless it's easy stuff like off a police scanner or a news conference, that's television people. And I don't mean to insult them. They never had as many reporters or as good reporters. Reporters on television, by and large, like to get on TV because they like their face to be seen. Print reporters, by and large, got into this business because they wanted to uncover what was going on and tell people about it. There's a difference in the culture and so many other things that lead people to those things. So I might be babbling there about that.
Well, let me make a point. If you watch television every day, certain segments of that newscast we welcome CNN's national reporter. We welcome the New York Times Metro reporter, or whatever. They are all depending on these voices and these guys, these people, to come and lend them that story to fill up some time spans that they have on the television, because they need fill. But if you go in the morning, you take a look at Morning Joe, or probably the CBS program, and maybe today, but definitely the Morning Joe program, you'll see there's always 6 or 7 people that are representing the print media. And so the network is dependent upon these print tubes.
Absolutely, television always has. I learned that very early in my career in a little one-horse town in Nebraska where I started. The Binghamton Press, I'll never forget this. I was a regional editor and I had a news release. It just didn't fit, a little thing, some agriculture related thing that didn't fit in the paper for about 2 weeks. Finally, it made its way in. And that night on the local TV news in Binghamton, that story ran. And I knew the news release had come out 2 weeks earlier, and I'd just been weighing, it's not that important, but we'll get it in if we get a court. And that's how dependent television is on what they read at the newspaper, or now the newspaper websites. There was a time in our newsroom when reporters did not want to post any news. They'd have a good story and they'd try and hold it back. Why? Because it would tip off the TV people. Because they would never know about it otherwise. Never. Yeah.
Roy, do you think that that our failure to celebrate journalists as one of the key defenders of democracy and to, in fact, put all our attention on soldiers has had an effect on sort of our attitude towards journalism in general, particularly starting in the 60s when reporters started to be vilified for their critical coverage of issues that patriots, in a way that patriots might object to the point where we now sing we say the Pledge of Allegiance or sing the national anthem they play it at the beginning of every performance, or they did at the high school and such. So we've glorified military, which is the first thing that dictators co-opt. They invite them to join them. Journalists are the first that they arrest.
I don't think those are mutually exclusive. I think we can support our military given the fact we're in 2 seemingly endless wars. Just adding more resources to that with a completely volunteer army. So I think civilians who don't serve or who have never served, I think, owe some degree of respect to the service. I teach active duty military students in a photo program. So I think we can give the respect that's due to the people in our service and still have an aggressive, hostile press. I said again, hostile press. A press that's going to ask the questions and be aggressive. I don't think patriotism is exclusive to those who wear a uniform.
It wasn't. My question was more the single. We have not seen reporters as defenders of democracy. We still don't see them as defenders of democracy.
If you, again, I know Stan cited a Pew Research study. Pew also does studies on respected professions, and journalists are not a respected profession. They're right below lawyers and used car salesmen. I cover 2 of those 3. My next stop is going to be at the used car lot next year. I'm going to lose my job for talking so much. But I mean, people need the press. They just don't. I think some people just don't realize it until it's time.
And there's nothing wrong with being patriotic. Nothing wrong. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to many people, including the defenders of the First Amendment and the 5 liberties that we want, that are a hallmark of our nation.
Think about this. Where would you be without a free press? What would your days be like without a free press? Think about the people who you respect that read respectable journalism. They're influenced. The senators, the congresspeople, the city council people, the guys up in Syracuse University teaching architecture, they're reading the papers. They are required to be updated with what's going on. And there isn't a guy that I don't speak to every day that says to me, what's happening? What's going on? It's just part of our flow of humanistic qualities that we want to know what's going on. And the newspaper is one of the values and one of the avenues that we seek to get to know what's going on.
But we're speaking of the choir here. How do we get to your kids?
Oh, okay, I got it.
Or your grandkids. I mean, how do we get them engaged in consuming news beyond a soundbite on either Fox or MSNBC?
And they don't realize how important it is to their occupation, their income, to know what's going on.
I don't have the answer. I don't know, Stan, maybe you.
I wish I did. If you're well informed, you will do better in life. You will see opportunities. Your career will flourish. Your business will flourish. The more informed you are, the better off things will be. And so there's a self-interest that maybe we need to let people know. If you inform yourself, you will do better in life. Your work, your business, your life will be better.
And one of the avenues of being informed is newspapers.
Yeah, it's not the only one, but it's a good one.
One trick is to put the sports page on the first page.
Yeah, especially in Syracuse. I remember that aide of Obama's was interviewed about selling the Iran deal, I think it was, and he was almost bragging about how easy it was to sucker journalists in Washington. He said that in Congress, they were all 20-something people who didn't have much background in anything, and it was easy to
drag them along. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I wonder if there are things that you think ought to be done to improve the education of journalists coming up.
Or regular people,
No,
folks in our schools.
I'm talking about the journalists in particular. I sometimes have the sense that a lot of people writing for news stories in the written press don't have much sense of history, or much sense of economics, or much sense of philosophical, much critical reasoning.
That's part of the problem in the industry now. We talked about the revenue has decreased and the need for immediacy has zoomed up. And what that has done is companies, media companies, newspaper companies have had to tighten their belts. And one way they do that is by reducing the number of editors who can direct and guide and teach. At the same time, because the audience, all of us, wants it immediately, there's no more time for editors really to pass that kind of judgment and send the reporter back over and over through the course of a day to further report, to find out more, to dig deeper, to check a fact, to see where the story might lead them in a different sort of way. So that's part of it. At the same time, I think a lot of organizations, especially some of the really digital organizations, the digital organizations, they're hiring youth, energy, people who are digital natives, who understand this. And so they may not have the same sort of experience that somebody who slogged away in a newsroom, a print newsroom for 30 years is going to have. And there are companies, media companies in Washington that just really want that youthful appearance, you know, on their videos, or when they play somebody on one of the cable shows or whatever. And then there's a herd mentality among these youthful people because there's not necessarily an editor telling them, no, you go there. Everybody else went there, go check out what's happening. What do they not want you to find out? Instead, they kind of move more in a pack. You know, we have a Washington correspondent still, the Post-Standard does in Washington, and he's told me that, and we both just, how can that be? How can that be? You know, but they don't have necessarily the direction that an editor would give. An old city editor who can direct a reporter, a new reporter, can teach them a lot about accuracy, fairness, getting the story straight, getting it right, asking more and more and more questions. And how do you know that? How do you know that? That's what editors do. And a lot of that is now missing, not because anybody wanted it to be missing, but the financial pressures, the immediacy pressures, so many pressures sort of took out that role. I don't know if...
Well, and today's reporter isn't just a reporter. They're also a social media star. They're also a curator. They're also going on TV to make appearances. So, you know, all that time that they have to spend tweeting or posting on social media is less time they can devote to the topic. That's one less source they get to call, one less document they get to review. So I think we're asking a lot more from our reporters, and that comes at a sacrifice. But you know, there's also, you know, it's also a double-edged sword because anybody can be a journalist in the United States. There's no exam, there's no licensing requirement. You don't even have to go to college. I mean, I've heard Stan in your travels with all, you know, people who, when you were starting out, there were probably dozens of professionals who did not even have college educations. And they were probably some of the best reporters you ever saw, right? Who knew just about everything they needed to know. So again, you know, the late 60s through the Watergate era sort of professionalized the media business. And journalism degrees became a popular thing. And even some of the old timers when you were starting out probably poo-pooed a journalism degree. You don't have a journalism degree, right?
No, I do.
You do?
No, I mean, it's a University of Nebraska, you can look it up.
I wasn't saying when you go to college. I meant to the point where, like English or history, where you know you would build up an expertise or a specialty, and then take that into journalism. And we do have, you know, plenty of experts out there who have graduate degrees in specialized topics, who know the ins and outs of what they're doing. But you know, then we also have the neophytes who are just out of school and are juggling a lot of different things all at once. So you know, we're looking for the right balance, I guess.
A couple of observations. Last week, we had David Mankiewicz who spoke about IAU, and there were 3 people from the press here. Spectrum sent somebody, WSYR Radio sent somebody, and Channel 9 sent somebody. Today, the subject is media, press, the delineation of the printed press, and not one of those dudes show up. Doesn't that say something?
Partly we know the story. It's our story, and we've always been reluctant to talk about ourselves in some ways, in our own media. But there's another lesson from last week. Spectrum, Channel 9, and those 3. What did Dave Mankiewicz say? As you've all read over, and because I was sitting right there next to Howie, as you've all read over and over in the Post-Standard, all of this stuff about I-81 has been thoroughly reported.
The Post-Standard has been exceptional.
So the Post-Standard didn't have to come to the presentation to hear what was going on. They'd already done that. But the 3 broadcast outlets, who never had the time to go through the hundreds, thousands of pages of this stuff, could only read the paper, and they do the easy thing. They'll show up at what amounts to a news conference. And, David was very good. I really enjoyed that. He was terrific. But they can get 30 seconds worth of video, a little voiceover, and voila, they have a story, and it looks like it's been reported. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't watch TV or that they don't add to the story, but it's not the same thing as what David was talking about. The Post-Standard has done for years and years about I-81.
And just this week, the editorial board wrote a very strong article about a local politician, and I admired it. You took a real stand, when I say you, the board.
Yeah, because that's not me.
Yeah, and not political, not to be political, but the board saw some very important things that had to be addressed, and they attacked them in this article.
Yeah, I think that's what an editorial board, the opinion part of the paper should always do. Take all the facts, weigh them, and they do there's a lot of arguing that goes on in those meetings, and then you come up with sort of a consensus and a way to move forward that takes into account the viewpoints.
Speaking of editorial pages in the paper as opposed to the news reporting off the editorial pages, the large newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, have their own in-house writers, columnists, editorial columnists, opinion writers that appear on their editorial pages. And then those are syndicated and picked up by the Post-Standard and other smaller papers throughout the country. This is a Post-Standard inner working question. Is there a demographic analysis of the readership of the Post-Standard to determine what is a logical balance of syndicated columns to print on a regular basis, and thereby drive one portion of the readership crazy because they're too conservative, another portion too liberal? How does that work? In other words, where does Cal Thomas come from?
See, you get that. You get that all the time. And what I would tell people is when they call to complain about whoever the columnist might be, I say, well, you have to look at the breadth of what we do every day. You can't just say, Cal Thomas is awful. I read what he wrote today, and how could you dare put that in the paper? It's insulting. Well, you got to read a lot of other columnists over time. You got to understand that not everybody's like you. We all have different viewpoints. We all want a different kind of information. We all want we want something, especially on those opinion pages, that will really make us think differently and evaluate where we're coming from. And so there's an effort. There's always been an effort, and I'm sure it has not gone away, to balance this out. You have some, you might say, that are from a liberal viewpoint, some from a conservative viewpoint, many in the middle, variety of subjects that they might be going after. And if you judge by just one column in one day, you might say, aha, see, Cal Thomas is awful. You shouldn't run it. But over time, you have to, that's the value of reading the paper regularly too. You see lots of different viewpoints. Is that
connected to the demographics at all? I mean, as far as, in other words, if you were trying to sell your paper in Trump country, you have
no, I
take a
can't.
certain number.
No, it's never come up. Not with us, that we would try and sell, maybe the closest we come to that is we cover SU sports, probably more than a lot. And why? Because, all right, here's a quiz. What is the largest selling day of the Post-Standard in its history?
The day after they won
the day after the national championship game. Holy cow! We had to start the press up and run it again. It still wasn't enough. And the front page, I don't know if they still sell reprints of that day's front page. There are, you see them all over town still. And the time SU beat Nebraska, my old town, in 1980. You still see that front page too. So SU sports might be, we know people enjoy it, so yeah, we cover it well.
Ronald Reagan had a saying, trust but confirm.
Verify.
Oh, verify. Okay.
We have questions in the back.
Oh, no, it's just off this idea of tailoring what's in the paper based on the population that you're going after. For example, you used to have Oswego editions, Madison County editions. You didn't change your editorial pages
No.
for those. Okay.
So what did you all learn today?
Eric has one more question. We might learn something.
Okay, go ahead.
Eric.
First, a comment for Roy. The used car business, people find them on the internet now, so.
I can start mine off.
And the question that I have is about letters to the editor as a way of connecting with the audience. Has there been much discussion while you were there about expanding that and getting more perspectives on a daily basis?
We've always loved letters to the editor. They're vibrant, they're interesting, they're a good part of the paper. And the whole time I was here, we devoted a whole page to them every single day, which, a lot of papers didn't devote that much space to. So we love letters. Problem is, as the internet has grown and people find other ways to get their opinion out, maybe faster, they email it to their friends, they post something on Facebook, they comment directly on the story or whatever it might be. There are fewer people writing letters to the editor. And I don't have hard data for you, but I know they were trending down, and I'm sure that trend has not reversed. So yeah, write a letter to the editor. See your name in the print. Come on, everybody here. That's what we've learned. Write a letter to the editor. Don't wait. Who do you want? Roy probably has to go back to work. I don't. So
This will be short, and then you can just do an opinion. You don't have to do a fact. But I think it's great that that there are different people, and then you can learn about what other people are thinking too. If everybody thought about the same thing. But I haven't heard anyone talking today to say fake news, fake news. I'm so sick of that man. I'm just like, his mouth opens. I pray, please say something.
You're not praying hard enough.
I know.
And you're not keeping your fingers crossed.
But I wondered if you had a thought about that, because I would like for us to be able to shut him up. And the only way we're going to do it is if we can get enough people together to do that.
You're politicking.
He's a scary man. See how he shakes hands with Putin? He wants to be just like them. That's why he's.
Well, you might be right. Here's the situation. He's protected by the same First Amendment free speech rights as the rest of us, and because he's president of the United States, he has a bigger
77,000 fake news.
I agree, but if you don't like something, there's two things. If you don't like certain speech, more speech will help. So the more you talk, write letters to the editor, the more you can balance out what you don't like or bring other people around your viewpoint. And the other thing is, I think something you were saying, somebody,
if you don't like what a politician is doing, there is, in America, a terrific way to solve that problem.
It happens in November.
And I'm doing it.
And, you know, and I think a two-party system, we need two strong parties.
Oh, agreed.
Because it's when the parties disagree and debate and discuss and point holes in each other that you begin to say, oh, well, this could be better if we took, you know, that's what you need. So it's not a party thing, it's when an individual takes advantage of the machinery that has been placed in their trust that perhaps is a problem.
Does anybody know what next week's speaker is?
What is civility?
Keith Bybee? Keith Bybee and Roy are pals. And when I called up Keith to come speak about how this year's primaries in politics will affect next year's 2020 election, he said, I'd rather speak on a subject that I'm more familiar with and have written about, called civility. Well, in this room, we're all civil with each other. Unfortunately, this lady with that nice black and white top doesn't think that the person who represents us over there on Connecticut Avenue or Pennsylvania Avenue is civil. It so happens she's right.
I thought something bad was coming.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.